fellow traveler. Welcome to Third Eye Awakening, a podcast all about spiritual and psychic awakening, where we talk about the shift from 3D to 5D consciousness, the nature of time, space, the universe, multi-dimensions, starseeds, the Akashic Records, all that good shit. I am your host, Amy Melissa. Thank you so much for being here with me today. All right, let's do this. Guys, I'm here a week later with an episode. I feel so good about this. I'm so pumped. How are you? I hope wherever you are, whatever is going on in your day, because sometimes days are really good and sometimes days are really not good, but I'm telling you, there's always magic there, and that's where your power lies, is in your ability to see the magic in all the situations. I want to begin this episode with a little bitty blurb that has nothing to do with the content of this episode. But I really feel inspired to share it, so that probably means that somebody needs and wants to hear it. So there was a period in my life, a pretty long period, where all I wanted was to have my magic and my gifts seen and acknowledged and validated. And I remember giving this book to my mom to read. It was called Indigo Children. And I had read it. I had just finished reading it. And when I read it, I was like, that's me. That's me. I just felt so articulated. And I gave it to my mom to read. And she read it, and then I asked her what she thought of it, and she was like, oh yeah, while I was reading it, I thought, I think Andrea is an indigo child, and Andrea is my youngest sister. And my heart broke in that moment. It broke because I just wanted her to be like, I think you're an indigo child. But of course, all she could do was reflect back to me my vibrational set point, which was the absence of that experience of being seen and validated. So, no criticism towards my mom. She loves me and she's done more to support me than I could ever enumerate or say. But I was really hungry for that for a really long time, and eventually I got to a place where I was able to give it to myself. But what I wanted to share here, my whole purpose in telling that little story, is that I want you to know that even if I don't know you personally and we've never had a virtual interaction, let alone a real life interaction, I see you and I validate you. You are magic AF, and I'm not kidding. This is not a buzzword for me that is like just a trendy thing right now. It's like the pure recognition that we are, how did it come through to me the other day? We are the cosmic lens through which the vision of God is translated. We are the cosmic lens that is translating the vision of God. And the vision of God is so infinite and multidimensional that it would blow our fucking nervous systems to smithereens if we were able to contain it even for a moment. So I really mean it when I say that I see and validate your magic and your power, and that you are gifted and you are awake. You are a soul on earth. You are a soul in a human body. It's a little bit like, this is kind of a rough analogy, but it's like when we get in our cars and drive it to a destination, or any car, whatever, whether we own it or not, we are not the car. We are the driver. And in a very similar way, we are not our humans. We are the driver of the human. But when we don't remember that, we think we are the human. And I mean, that's not a perfect analogy, because of course we are human too. We absolutely are. But that saying that we are a soul having a human experience is so true. And sometimes when we don't remember that, we're actually a soul and that we are the cosmic lens translating the vision of God, then it is easy to forget how to drive the car. And the car drives us, or so it seems. No, we're always driving, we just forget. Anyway, that's all. I just wanted to share that before I launch into more of Cillian's story, because I think you're beautiful and amazing, and I really mean that. And I really hope that you feel it. I get way better acoustics in my kitchen, so here I am now, and guys, I have a really ugly kitchen. I live in a rental, and overall, the place is great, but this kitchen, I'm telling you, it is not redeemable. The floors are so 70s ugly in a way that you can't, make it cute. And there's a window, but it looks into a garage. Anyway, this is my level of dedication to this podcast, is that I would sit in the kitchen for an hour and talk, just so you have better acoustics to enjoy. Okay, so getting to it. I last left you at the very traumatic birth of my son, Cillian. And I'm going to tell you now all about the little being that I encountered earthside at the other end of that segment of the story. So I realized when I was listening back to the last episode that I told you all that I was going to let you know that I really wasn't certain that I was ever in preterm labor. Now, I mean, at the time, I just, wasn't. When you're in labor under normal circumstances, never mind scary ones where you think your baby's going to die, you just don't have access to your rational linear brain. You definitely go into a mammalian lizard brain, and not in a bad way, but just where you don't have well articulated thoughts, and it's very hard to speak up for yourself, or just speak up in general, because it just uses a different part of your cognition. So, but later upon reflection, I came to a point where I'm really questioning that I was ever in preterm labor. What I think was happening was that I was having Braxton Hicks, which bums me out to think about that, but it also, I really truly have made peace with Cillian's life and death. But yeah, because they weren't painless, the contractions weren't painless, and as a midwife, I have encountered some other situations of preterm labor, which at times resulted in a baby who was born alive and able to live, and at times resulted in a stillbirth or a baby who died shortly after. So situations not dissimilar to my own. And in all of those situations, my understanding based on what was being described was that the contractions were painful. And the early contractions that I had before I told the nurse were not painful at all. The pain didn't start until I was moved over to the labor and delivery ward after I had had a vaginal exam done against my wishes. And I believe that my experience of pain was directly correlated to my experience of fear. So right now, where it stands, I mean, it's one of those things where I'll never know the truth, and it's all about the way that my mind frames the story. But my current framing is that I think I was having Braxton Hicks because it was my second pregnancy, and it tends to start around 26, 27, 28 weeks. And I didn't have them in my pregnancy with Francis, so I never would have known what they were. Anywho, regardless, Cillian was born. And as I was lying on the table, having the remains of my placenta removed and like being completely checked out, what's that word? Disassociated, being completely disassociated, I didn't even know if my child was alive or not. I didn't know anything, and neither did Alex. All he knew was that he missed it. And they sort of finished up, you know, removing the placenta, and they kind of like moved me over into another bed, like because I was on the operating table. They moved me back into a wheelie bed, and they wheeled me out to recovery, and my legs were still numb, and I still had a catheter in. And I remember I had texted a few people after I had consented to the C-section to let them know that he was being born. And so my parents were on their way. My sister and brother-in-law were on their way. My parents had Francis with them. And my friend Erin was on her way. And my friend Sue was on her way. And I actually can't remember if Nancy was there, but I don't think so. Sue and Nancy are sisters, and they both live in the city where I was. And I met up with Erin and Andrea and Sue in recovery with Alex. And I remember kind of laughing. And to them, I don't know, I wonder if they kind of thought that my response was a little bit crazy. You know, sometimes when you're watching shows about like murder or whatever, or suspicious deaths or what have you, and the police comment that the response of, you know, a family member or a spouse or something to the death is odd. I've always kind of thought, and sort of had my suspicions confirmed, that like it's easy to have an odd response because something has just happened that is so fucking life altering that your brain can't accept it, and your brain searches for an escape and creates like an interaction that resembles just like average everyday life when you're safe, you know, like that's just a self-preservation response. Anyway, so they probably thought I was a little bit weird. I'm not sure, but I remember, you know, like little harmless, good-natured jokes were being told, and I was kind of laughing, and I kept saying, holy shit, I'm not pregnant anymore. Like hoping that it would sink in, but it wasn't sinking in. But I could feel that Cillian was separate from me, but I had inadvertently put a wall up so that I had distanced myself from him because I didn't even know if he was alive. I didn't know anything. And so I felt that he wasn't there anymore, but I had just like some bit of wiring switched over in my brain so that I wasn't really wrapping my head around what that could mean. And eventually the neonatologist who I had spoken to earlier, who had kind of convinced me to go for the C-section, she came by, and she came to talk to me, and I said, she let me know that he was doing well. And I was like, oh, he's alive? And she said, no one's told you? Like, you don't know anything about? And I was like, no. So, you know, I don't know. That's just the experience in the hospital. It's not because anybody's an asshole. It's just that's just the reality of being in the hospital. Especially a large, busy hospital is dealing with a lot of acute emergencies. If you are not in a state of emergency in any given moment, you are like definitely an afterthought. So she went and took a picture of him with her phone. No, with my phone. She took my phone and took a picture of him and brought it for me and Alex to see. And you guys, I had been so worried about what he was going to look like. Like, I was afraid there was going to be something wrong with him, like that he just wasn't going to look right to me. That's just a scary thought. And I've heard other women say the same thing. And he was so beautiful. He was so perfect. I'll ask Alex if I'm allowed to share that picture, like if he also is okay with my sharing that picture. And if he is, then I'll figure out somewhere to share it, and I'll let you know. But he was so beautiful and perfect, and I just couldn't. I was so amazed and so eager to see him, and yet still disconnected. It took quite a while for me to reconnect to myself after all of that. And eventually they let us go see him. I think they still had to wheel me in on the hospital bed because I couldn't walk, because the spinal was still, like everything from my waist down was numb and not reliable. But anyway, they let us go in, and he had been intubated by then, and he was wrapped in plastic, because that's what they do. And when babies are born so preterm, they don't have any fat deposits to help them maintain their body weight, so they get really cold and they go into cold shock easily. So they get wrapped while they're being sort of like having the initial resuscitation done. They get wrapped in plastic that helps to retain their body heat, and then eventually they get transferred to those like isolate incubators that have regulated temperature to help them stay properly warm. But he was so incredibly, humblingly beautiful and perfect. He was tiny, 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 but he was right along the 50th percentile, just like the ultrasounds said. I'm just pulling up pictures of him so I can kind of remember. He weighed 880 grams at birth. Oh, there he is. Oh my God, he's so beautiful. He weighed 880 grams at birth. So that's just under 2 pounds. It's like 1 pound, 15 ounces, I think, or 14.8 or something ounces. So he weighed less than 2 pounds of butter. Like if you hold 2 things of butter in your hands, he weighed less than that. Isn't that crazy? Oh, but he was so beautiful. And one of the first things I noticed is that he looked so much like Alex, like identical, like a mini clone to the T, but he had my chin. I have a big dimple in my chin, and he had that little dimple. So he was born on June 29th, 2016, in the middle of the day at 12:30, a vaginal birth that was supposed to be a C-section. And Alex and I kind of cried as we touched him, but I know we were both in such tremendous shock. My brain really couldn't properly process it. It couldn't process everything that had just happened. That night, so he stayed at the same hospital that I did. And that night, he was up on, I think it was the 16th floor. He was on the 16th floor, and I think I was on the 10th floor or the 12th floor of the hospital. But he was obviously in the neonatal intensive care unit, and I went back to my room on the antenatal unit, but I was only allowed to stay for 24 hours. So 24 hours after his birth. So at midday, like at noon the following day, I was officially discharged. And that night, my sister and brother-in-law were there, and my parents and Francis, and we all took our chance to go in and see him. But he was also in a lot of shock, I have no doubt, because those first couple days it was really hard to connect with him. I could sense his spirit there, but it's like it was taking all of his soul's focus to mediate the intense stimulus that he was receiving at a time in his development when he was supposed to be in a dark, watery, protected womb. He wasn't supposed to have things touching his skin. He wasn't supposed to have lights. He wasn't supposed to have anything shoved into his airways to ventilate his lungs. He certainly wasn't supposed to have needles in his skin and IVs in place. And of course, that all of those things are necessary to help keep a baby alive who's born at that gestation. But I can just imagine looking at the pictures of him, how incredibly intrusive and really violent and traumatic that all must have felt for his little nervous system. Oh God, he was so beautiful. So I felt so disregarded in the need and expectation that I'd be discharged 24 hours later. And on one hand, I perfectly, completely understood the reason for this and the necessity of this, that in Ontario, where we don't pay out of pocket for all of these things, as residents, we have automatic healthcare, provincial healthcare insurance that covers the costs. So I wasn't paying for this, but of course it still costs a lot to have somebody in a bed in a hospital room. Not only that, but as a specialized hospital, they have a high volume of people needing to come in at any given time, and they can't have the bed taken up by someone who clinically does not need to be there anymore. So I really understand the logistics as to why I was, discharged, and basically it felt like an eviction 24 hours after he was born. But I felt like I had been through so much trauma. I needed more care, and there's nothing in place for me on the other side. There's nothing, just the way the system is set up, you just don't matter. There's nothing for you. There's nothing to make sure that you are being taken care of, that you're not going to hemorrhage, that, anything, whatever. And never mind the emotional aspect of processing all of that trauma from my end. And of course, there's absolutely nothing in place for husbands, partners, fathers, other parents. It's just hard. It is what it is. Our system is not perfect, but it's also not the worst. So I was discharged, and the really tricky part about that was that Alex and I don't live in that city we don't live there now, but at the time we didn't live there. We lived about an hour and a half away from the city where that hospital is located, where our son was now, admitted as a patient. And I had nowhere else to go. I suppose I could have stayed at my sister's, but there was no room for Alex and I to stay at her house. She just lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with her husband, and there just wasn't room for us. And to be honest, it didn't occur to me because I was still in complete fight or flight. it didn't occur to me to ask, and I don't think it occurred to anybody to offer. It just wasn't like, it was kind of the last thing on anybody's mind. And I know Alex just wanted to go home together. I had already been away for about 10 or 11 days. And he just, like, his way of dealing with the trauma of everything that had just happened was to go home together to our bed and just go back to normal. And it was so hard to leave the city that he was in, leave the hospital, and then leave the city and drive an hour and a half away and to go home without him. And we slept, we both needed it very badly. And then in the morning, I remember, I woke up, I probably slept something like 6 hours, like maybe 8, I don't know. I know I slept hard, but I also, as soon as I woke up, I remembered that he was gone and that I needed to get back to him. And it was like a mammal level instinct. It was not my thoughts. It was like my whole body. Everything in me needed to get back to him. And it was like I had a compass in my heart that was pointing me in the direction, the geographical direction that he was located. And it was like, I remember standing at the window and kind of scratching at it and pawing at it, like, let's go, let's go. And Alex, on the other hand, because he hadn't gestated Cillian, like Cillian was a very abstract concept to him already. I had the benefit of carrying him in my womb, so I felt all the changes to my body as there were changes to my life, and I felt him kicking and moving all the time, so I felt very separate from him once I had kind of like calmed down and reset myself after some sleep. I felt very separate from him, but for Alex, I think the way it translated was like just a lot of trauma, and that Cillian himself was a very abstract concept and not really real to Alex. And what he wanted to do was just like stay home and make our coffee and do our morning ritual that we had kind of done before I went into the hospital, and just sort of go into a state of, denial without meaning to about everything that had happened. And I was like pawing at the window, like, let's go, we gotta go. It couldn't happen fast enough for me. So we did that for a couple of days. I think on the first day that we got there, or maybe the second day, we met up with a social worker who was assigned to us, and she was incredible at her job. She was an angel to me, a literal angel. Her name was Sari. I remember what she looked like, but I don't remember anything else. But she told us about the Ronald McDonald House, which was located close by to the hospital, and let us know how to apply to get in there. She also sat, and when she asked me how I was feeling, and I told her that I felt really disassociated and traumatized, and like I didn't know how to process what had happened. And she just invited me to tell her my perspective of everything that had happened. And Alex, we were sitting together, and she got us to walk her through everything that had happened. And that was so fucking helpful. I was amazed at how helpful it was. And I was so thankful to her that she, gave us 40 minutes of her time so that we could do that, and invited us to do it. And she was so patient about it. And she would say, she would give little prompts, but they weren't patronizing. Like if I sort of paused, she would say, and what were you thinking when that was happening? Like, what were you feeling? Like, she would just kind of prompt me, and she approached me with an air of genuine caring and curiosity, of wanting to hear my story, or my experience. I guess it didn't even feel like a story then. It just felt like an experience that I was trying to understand. And she just had the perfect approach for me, probably for anyone. She really was an angel. So that really helped a lot, helped me to come back into my body and come back to earth. and helped me to connect with what was going on. And then we also applied to get into the Ronald McDonald House, and after a few days we were so lucky that a room became available, and we were allowed to go there. And that was huge. That was so huge, because otherwise we were driving back and forth every day. And meanwhile, I was also pumping breast milk every 4 hours, because for preterm babies especially, I mean, I had breastfed Francis for a year, and I was a freaking midwifery student, so I always intended to breastfeed. That was always my plan. I mean, I don't feel politically strong about it. I certainly don't want to make anybody feel less than anyone ever, any mother ever. But for me, I feel like I am able to, and that's a beautiful thing, and it's such an important part of my bonding with my baby. And so I had always planned to do it, but with a preterm baby especially, it's very, very important. And if you, for some reason, are unable to produce your own breast milk, then they have the option of feeding preterm babies donor breast milk that goes through a rigorous screening and sterilization process. Like, what's it called? When milk, pasteurization, kind of, because it's the most easily and fully digested substance to nourish a baby. And formula is not benign. It's not benign. It's if you can't feed your baby breast milk for any reason, then it's amazing that formula exists, so that we can feed babies according to the nutritional ratios that they require. But it's not an analog to breast milk, and it just has different shaped particles, different shaped proteins, and those things are very hard on the digestive tract of preterm infants. And we know that it increases the likelihood of something called necrotizing enterocolitis, which is basically it's basically an ischemia of the bowel, which means that in the intestinal tract of a preterm baby, or any baby, but it's mostly something that affects preterm babies, there are spots to the bowel that don't get enough blood for a number of reasons I won't go into, because I do have a tendency to over-medicalize everything, and I think I'm already doing it. And so those spots, eventually a bunch of the cells start to die because they're not getting enough blood, so they're not getting enough oxygen. And as they die, they trigger more cells around them to die. And eventually enough of it dies that a hole is created in the wall of the intestine, and all the bacteria leaks from the intestine into the bloodstream, and then creates a systemic infection that's traveling all over the baby's body through his or her circulation. So in order to create the best chances of preventing that, I was encouraged to pump every 4 hours. And so for the first 3 days, we were driving back and forth an hour and a half each way, and I was pumping every 4 hours. And, we were trying to adjust to this new, drastically altered reality. And I remember, and Alex and I are both water signs, P.S. He's a Pisces and I'm a Scorpio. And so we're super, I would say he's more prompt than I am. You may have observed from my podcast episode publication pattern that I am not somebody who is really prompt and timely, and that's just me, and I'm cool with it. But sometimes Alex isn't either, and we're definitely morning dawdlers together, and so it would just be hard for us to get organized to get to the city. But the feeling of being separate from Cillian felt like agony. It felt like all the wrongness. It was so wrong. It was so wrong. And I remember arriving one of the days before we got into the Ronald McDonald House, and the nurse who was assigned to him for that day, which they were always fluctuating, by the way, so that was another fun detail. The nurse that day, her name was Josephine, she said to me, all day I've been wondering where his parents are. And it was very judgy. It was very judgy, and it really hurt because all I wanted was to be with him. That was all I wanted. And it was also so, whatever. She was probably totally burnt out. But it was very ignorant of the experience of being a parent to a baby in delicate condition in a neonatal intensive care unit, and how stressful that is, and how sometimes I think you just can't, like, your brain can't do it anymore. You just can't be there. Like, it's not because you don't love your baby, it's because it's so traumatic for you, and you just need that sacred break, that sacred pause. Anyhow, after a few days, we got into the Ronald McDonald House, and that was when things really started to settle in. And I was shown how to hand hug within the first couple of days. It was like by that beautiful social worker. She showed me how to hand hug Cillian, which is just holding your hands over without touching your baby, but just holding them over, just hovering over your baby, and enjoying that proximity. And when I did that, that was the first oxytocin bonding that I had with him, because I didn't get to have him immediately post-birth. And so I didn't really get that oxytocin bond right away. But when I put my hands over him and I connected to his energy, I did have that big rush of oxytocin, and it was beautiful. And I think that was our first reconnecting together. And it also felt a lot like giving Reiki to a baby, or giving Reiki to him. Like there was communication, energy communication happening. And eventually I was allowed to hold him. By the time we rolled into July, I was allowed to hold him, and that was amazing. It was amazing. I would position him over my heart and hold his tiny little body on my chest. And they only let me hold him for, like maybe half hour or an hour at a time. And then they would tell me he had to go back. And they told me it was because it was stressful on their systems and whatever. And I guess he would have episodes of bradycardia, so his heart rate would slow or something like that. I don't really know. I don't remember seeing that, because I know what bradycardia is and I was watching the monitors. Honestly, I think is just sort of a continuation of the medical system sort of like taking ownership of its patients. And so it was very frustrating to have a complete fucking stranger dictate whether or not I could hold my baby. Like that was very difficult and frustrating and super patronizing. And it wasn't any of the nurses in particular who were, frustrating me. It was just the whole setup of the situation where I was like, I'm his environment. I am his environment. I am me. Me is. But anyway, it is what it is. One thing I remember noticing about Cillian was as the initial days went on, he was doing really well, by the way, really well. They did a cranial ultrasound on his head because preterm babies are prone to brain bleeds and seizure activity, and he didn't have either, and that was really incredible. And he didn't, I'm sorry for the yawn. He didn't need to be on excessive medications. He was on something called TPN, total parenteral nutrition, which was an IV infusion of like all of the vitamins and minerals that, you know, a baby needs, because he wasn't mature enough to like drink breast milk just yet. They were trying him on it. Sometimes he would tolerate it and sometimes he wouldn't, but it was never like he was too little to nurse. He would get it through an NG tube. But he was doing really well. The main issue was that he required like pretty aggressive ventilation for his lungs to keep him oxygenated, because presumably because my water had been broken, so he didn't have all of the benefit of being able to fully proliferate lung tissue that he would have with the amniotic fluid if it had been a normal quantity. But he was doing well, and nobody communicated to us any concerns about his chances for survival. What was always communicated to us was a general message of like, you know, the time in the NICU is like a roller coaster ride, and there'll be, I remember having people say this to me, the neonatologists and the nurses. It was kind of a roller coaster ride, and to be prepared that some days and weeks he would have really good days and weeks, and then he would suddenly, like, often they would pick up an infection, or, you know, something would happen and they would take a downturn and it would be pretty stressful and things would be hanging in the balance, but then they pull through and they do well. And the main goals were to get him, you know, breathing with minimal assistance, or hopefully no assistance required, and tolerating oral feeds, and hopefully learning how to nurse, and gaining enough weight. Those were the main goals. And then, so that would take probably about 13 to 14 weeks, because that's how much pregnancy he had left, most likely. And then, you know, we would take him home. And so the warnings we were getting were just to know that he's doing really well, but he will have downturns, and that's just part of it. So some things I noticed about him once he sort of settled into his body a little bit is that he was a little ball of power and might and fury. I think he would have been a little hellraiser if he had lived. I really do. I think he would have caused me to go completely gray. He would try and extubate himself. All less than 2 pounds of him. He would try and pull out his breathing tube. And so they had to switch him to a different form of ventilation. Now, other babies do that too. I think it's because it's, you know, feels foreign and invasive. But it just cracks me up that he had so much might that he would grab it and try and pull it out. And I witnessed it myself. He would also, if he was positioned in a prone position, so lying on his little tummy, once he got sick of it, he would try and roll himself over. You'd see this little tiny, tiny being, this little pink, tiny baby, trying to kick himself so that he could build enough momentum to roll over. And of course, then I would tell the nurse, and she would roll him over and reposition him. But his aura was so powerful. Like, not that I ever thought that babies' souls were not powerful, but it was just another level of reinforcement that although he was incarnated into a tiny baby body, and that baby body was born even earlier than the average baby is born, he was like a fully developed soul, and was none too pleased about the discomfort he was feeling. But he also had this beautiful little soft side that I could really feel when I was holding him. Like, he would just sort of melt into my heart when I would hold him on my chest. And that was the part that was frustrating, when they would sort of dictate how often I got to hold him. Not that I had a lot of time, mind you, because pumping every 4 hours and then meticulously washing and sterilizing the pump equipment is a lot of work, not to mention like needing to eat, sleep, and shower occasionally. But yeah, the times that I was holding him, I would just feel his whole body relax, and I would just feel, it was like he just melted into me. And sometimes I would wash my hands well and sterilize them or whatever, use the hand sanitizer, sanitize them. And I would put them in the isolette, and I would, just lightly stroke his little cheek or just put my hand near him. And I have this one beautiful picture where he was holding my fingers, one in each hand. He's just holding my fingers. And I remember whispering to him, I had Francis with me, and I had to take him back. I had to go, and I wasn't going to be back for a while, for some long hours, maybe until the next day. And I remember whispering to him that he needed, that I had to go, and I was sorry, and I loved him so much, and I would be back. Mama's coming back. And he squeezed my fingers tighter, like, no, don't go, Mama. It was really beautiful and exhilarating to meet him and feel his power and his might. And I was so certain that he was sticking around. I was so certain. It just felt like obvious. Like, again, nobody was saying anything otherwise. And I honestly don't know if they were just trying to hide anything from us, or if they really just believed that he was doing really well. I think they believed it. And I mean, he was doing well. He was doing well. Let's see. So yeah, I had Francis there with me for about a week. Just me and him. Alex had been there for a few days, and then his school semester started up again, and that was his way of coping. His way of coping was just to keeping on. So he went back to school, and I had Francis with me, and that was really wonderful and really comforting, but it was also really hard because, he was 11. What 11-year-old wants to spend all day, every day in a neonatal intensive care unit? None of them. It's just not an enjoyable place to chill out. And I was aware, I felt really torn between my two children. I felt overwhelmed having him there by myself. And my parents were away, so that's why he was with me, and also just to be with me, but it ended up being really hard. There was so little that I could do to be fun with him. He was just sort of tagging along, and everything in my life was about Cillian that week. So the day finally came where I was driving him back. I was driving him to I think it was to my grandparents' house, or maybe to his dad's house. But anyway, it was a long drive. It was a good 2-hour drive, and we had one of the best conversations we've ever had. And he's such an amazing soul. He's so understanding and so forgiving of me. And even though that was a really hard week, he just didn't hold it against me. He didn't internalize it to mean that his mom didn't love him at all. In fact, he told me that I'm really strong, which, coming from your 11-year-old, is like, oh. So I drove him back, And I think I drove him in the morning. I think that's what happened. I said goodbye to Cillian in the morning, and I drove him in the morning. And then I went to visit my grandfather because I had to tell him that I'd had a baby. He didn't even know I was pregnant. And so I went and I told him, and then I was getting really antsy, and I was like, I need to go back. And because I was even farther away now from the city where Cillian was. So I left and I came back. And I got to the hospital, and like I practically ran there. It was just so, like, I don't know. I couldn't get there soon enough. And I got to help do his cares that night. I got to change his diaper, and kind of, they didn't bathe them per se, but you know, like kind of wipe him down a little bit, wipe his eyes and things like that, and sing him his song. Oh, his song. So I had a song for Francis that I used to sing to him all the time, and I knew when I had Cillian that I had to find Cillian's song. And it turned out that Cillian's song was the song that way at the beginning of the journey, before I even met Alex, was the song that kind of was haunting me, was standing out to me, and that was Gold Day by Sparkle Horse. It's such a beautiful song, and it was the most fitting song imaginable. And so the lyrics go, "Good morning, my child. Stay with me a while. We've not got any place to be. Won't you sit a spell with me? You've got diamonds for eyes. It's time for you to rise and evaporate in the sun. Sometimes it can weigh a ton. Keep all your crows away. Hold skinny wolves at bay. In silver piles of smiles, may all your days be gold, my child." And so after he was born, and I kind of was like letting the song come through, like knowing that there was a song for him, and just letting it take its time to arrive to my consciousness. And that song came through, I was like, oh fuck, it was you. It was you. You're the one that brought me that song before you even were in my womb. Before I even knew your dad, you brought me that song, because this was always going to happen. And we've been together for so much longer than I've even known, and you've been with me. It was a really cool feeling. It really initiated me, to a new level of understanding spirit baby communication. So I would sing that song to him every day, multiple times a day. Whenever I held him, I would sing it to him. I would sing it to him in his isolette. It was his song, and it was just coming straight from my heart to him. So I sang him his song that night, and I went back and slept for the first night in the Ronald McDonald House, in our room there, by myself, which was kind of sad and lonely, but also just, I was tired. And I got up the next morning, and I went to a little session. They had really cool sessions for parents of babies in the NICU to learn about different things, about just different topics that would be relevant. And the session that I went to was about the importance and value of reading to your babies during their hospital stay, even if they don't understand. And it was a really cool little session. I mean, I didn't need any convincing, but it was nice a nice opportunity to go and meet other parents. And I just remember like that first day by myself, not like I didn't have Alex, I didn't have Francis, it was just me and Cillian. And I was like, okay, like this is my life for the next few months. This is just what I do. And I'm here and like, I'm going to read to him. I'm going to, next time I'm home, I'm going to dig out my books and I'm going to buy new books. There was an Indigo gift store down in the lobby. Indigo is like Barnes and Noble, but Canada version or whatever. It's a big bookstore. And like, I just remember totally feeling like this is what I do now. And like, I remember buying The Secret Garden because I loved that book. And I was like, well, I'm just going to read The Secret Garden to Cillian. I'm going to be I loaded up snacks in his like little individual room in the hospital, and we couldn't eat in the room, but I had snacks there so that I could just easily step out into the hallway to eat like outside of the NICU, but not away from the hospital, or even like on a different floor. There's a little parent unit, and then I could come back, and I was just ready to just like, settle in, hunker down, do this thing with him. And I went to that session and I got this book. They had a bunch of books that you could choose from, and it was The Big Red Barn by Margaret Wise Brown. And I went back to his room, and I got to hold him and sing to him. Oh, I remember actually when I was taking when I was taking him home and I got back, Alex was there that night. I forgot. Alex was there that night. He came to be with Cillian while I was gone, which was wonderful. So Cillian wasn't alone. And when I got back, Alex was holding Cillian, and I knew they only let us each hold him once a day, and that I wasn't going to get a chance that day. And I remember being so fucking mad at Alex, irrationally. Like, it wasn't... Of course he should hold his son. Of course he should. But I was so mad because I was like, this is my last chance. Like, that thought came unbidden into my mind. And I cried and just had to deal with it. And then he left and went back and whatever, had that sleep, and then got up the next morning and went to that little reading session. And I got one more chance to hold him and snuggle with him. And everything seemed fine and normal. There was nothing immediately on my radar. And I went downstairs to the cafeteria to get some lunch. And while I was sitting there by myself, I just started crying. And I remember having the thought, this is all worth it just for the honor of being his mother. And as soon as that thought passed through my brain, I was like, what the fuck? Where did that come from? Because it didn't, I don't know if you've ever had that experience where you think a thought and it comes in, and it's not formed by your conscious mind. It comes in from somewhere else, some other part of your knowing. And you're like, what? It was like that. And I just chalked it up to feeling emotional about being by myself. But I really knew that it was heralding something else. And I finished my lunch. And I went back upstairs to his room. Maybe it was dinner. I don't know. I mean, all the days just melted in together. But at any rate, there had just been a shift change of nurses. And the new nurse was one that had never been assigned to Cillian before. And so we were kind of talking to each other and chatting. And I looked at him and I said, he doesn't look very good. And she looked at him and she said, yeah, you're right, but I don't know. I don't have anything to compare it to because I've never seen him before. You would be a better judge of that. And I said, yeah, he doesn't look good. Something's wrong. And she said, okay, let me find one of the doctors. And a doctor came by and looked at him, and I mean, none of the numbers were really showing anything drastically different on the monitors, monitoring his vital signs. But they're also not going to take any chances with such a fragile life. And it's not that they didn't believe me. It's just they didn't have any evidence that something was wrong, but they were going to look into it. And I think he looked waxy. That's my best way of describing it. He had a bit of a yellowness to him that wasn't usually there, and he didn't have jaundice anymore at that point, and he just looked waxy. And so they asked me to leave again because they needed to do some x-rays on him and figure out what was going on. So they said, oh, it must have been lunch. I had been down for lunch because then when I came back up, they needed to do x-rays. And they said, why don't you go get some supper? And I was like, well, I just had a late lunch, so I don't really need anything. But okay, I'll go find something to do. And I went downstairs and I was kind of panicking. And I kind of knew. But I knew on a level that my conscious brain did not accept. And I walked through the halls and I read, they had pictures of NICU survivors on the walls and like little bits of their stories. And I read those and I tried to bolster myself. And then I went down to the Indigo bookstore and I found a book about a baby who had been born preterm and had survived, but it was like kind of a book written about, the difficulty of the NICU journey. And I sort of killed time with like maximum anxiety and probably ate 1,000 cookies. And then eventually, I think like an hour later, I went back up and received some of the worst news I've ever received in my life. And I'm going to leave it there until the next episode. Thank you so much for joining me. As usual, I really hope that you find this episode interesting, helpful, inspirational in any way. My big takeaway is the power of our intuition and the power of soul connection. Let me know what your takeaway is. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, I would love to hear from you. I really would. It would mean the whole world to me. So you can screenshot yourself listening to it and then load it up to your Instagram stories or your Facebook stories and tag me. I am Amy Melissa on Facebook. I am at thenorthstar.love on Instagram. You can follow me at either of those places. I would love to connect with you. You can direct message me. You can join my free Facebook group, Soul Space, where currently right now I'm breaking down all of my manifestation processes for the ways that I've manifested certain things, such as my relationship with Alex, my pregnancy with my daughter Kira and Aoife. Next up is my dream job, and then my move to my desired location. And yeah, we'll just have interesting conversations there. If you know somebody who would benefit from this episode, please share it with them. Otherwise, just thank you for being here. I genuinely love you, and I look forward to connecting with you again in the next episode.